will turn to snow, particularly above around 300-400 metres. Now, overnight through Wednesday into Thursday, that rain grinds to a halt across Scotland. We will see some showers track across England and Wales, and then more wet weather arrives across Northern Ireland as we head into Thursday morning. Through Thursday morning, some pockets of frost, but generally speaking, there'll be more cloud, temperatures slightly higher. And you'll notice through the day, the air temperature will become a bit milder. So not as bad, not as cold outside, but we will see some rain, particularly towards the west as well as the north. And eventually this bit of showery rain across Wales as well as the West Country extends across towards the Midlands as well as the southeast as we head into the afternoon. So some wet weather to come, some windy conditions, temperatures on the up though, milder towards the south as well as the west. Double figures here. A lot of rain though for Scotland. That rain will slowly ease as we head into Christmas Eve, and through Christmas Eve and into Christmas Day things turn a little bit colder across the north. The chance of some snow showers across the far northeast, more rain towards the south where it will remain mild. See you later.
Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
You're watching GB News live across the UK and the world on our digital stream.
GB News is Britain's news channel.
We are the UK's home of discussion and debate from all perspectives.
We are here for you. Don't forget to join our YouTube community by clicking on that subscribe button.
And if you want the GB News app, you can click and catch up on programmes anytime.
We love to hear from you, so email us.
gbviews@gbnews.uk.
Thanks for being part of the GB News family.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
I'm Colin Brazier. I've reported from more than 70 countries around the world, covered wars from Afghanistan to Iraq, from Lebanon to the Balkans. I'm trying to bring that experience, that feel for events, to the studio. And something else. I'm ready to give an opinion. Today's stories with a spark. Brazier from 8 p.m. weekdays on GB News.
Merry Christmas and a lonely New Year. This morning we are facing the positively bonkers prospect of a Christmas free-for-all paid for by a harsh set of January restrictions. Today we'll be exploring that worrying prospect across our United Kingdom. And we're seeing a fresh round of COVID grants just as growth figures have been revised down. What does that mean for the pound in our pocket? Good morning, it's 9 o'clock and you're watching The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood. Back to you after the news with Rosie Wright.
The self-isolation period for people who test positive for COVID-19 and who are fully vaccinated in England has been cut down from 10 days to 7. Those infected with the virus must produce a negative lateral flow result on day 6 and day 7 of their isolation period. The Health Secretary says the move will reduce disruption to people's lives and help thousands enjoy Christmas with their families. It comes as the Prime Minister has ruled out the introduction of any new restrictions before Christmas Day, but says new measures could be brought in after. Labour's Shadow Secretary for Work and Pensions, John Ashworth, says the public and businesses need clarity, though, for what happens beyond Christmas Day.
Because the British people have been sensible and they are showing leadership themselves,
It does look like the infection rates have plateaued over the last couple of days. It's still a high-level infection, of course. I think the issue now, though, is that everybody is anticipating that something will happen after Christmas. Indeed, that's the briefing from the government sources to newspapers. Briefings to newspapers isn't good enough. I think businesses who need to order stock for post-Christmas in the run-up to New Year's Eve need clarity. We all need to know where we stand.
In Wales, workers could be fined £60 for going to their office under new coronavirus laws. The Welsh Government has announced that unnecessarily attending a workplace is now a criminal offence amid the spread of the Omicron variant. However, people in Wales are allowed to visit pubs and restaurants, and there's no limit on household mixing. The Welsh Government is expected to brief the public later today on any further potential measures amid soaring cases in the country. Independent businesses have criticised the £1 billion support package announced by the Treasury, saying it will not be enough to help them through a difficult Christmas period. The Chancellor announced one-off grants of £6,000 per premise for firms in the hospitality and leisure sector. Dave Mountford is co-founder of the Forum of Pubs and Pub Landlords. He told GB News that many businesses might not survive the winter.
We have absolutely, in a space of 10 days, lost pretty much 50% of our trade. Voices aren't being heard, and we're not being listened to by government. We're not being represented correctly, and consequently I've yet to meet or speak to anybody in the last sort of 12 hours who has welcomed this as being anything other than a real drop in the ocean.
Israel is going to become the first country in the world to administer a fourth COVID-19 jabs to the over 60s. Well, it comes amid concern about the spread of the new Omicron variant, with the first confirmed death in Israel this week. Although the decision is pending formal approval by senior health officials, Prime Minister Naftali Bennett is already urging Israelis to get the dose as soon as possible. The UK's chief medical officers have praised NHS staff for their essential and tireless work during the pandemic. They are warning of a tough winter ahead, though, with the Omicron variant. Although they hoped COVID would be less dominant in 2022, they're urging staff to prepare for multiple challenges as hospital admissions with the Omicron variant are rising very rapidly. The UK's chief medical officers have also appealed to the public to get vaccinated and boosted, as they say it's the best countermeasure. Now, in other news, the UK economy has grown at a much slower pace than first thought between July and September, before the impact of the new COVID Omicron variant. The Office for National Statistics said the economy expanded by 1.1% in the third quarter of the year, compared with an initial estimate of 1.3%. Experts expect the economy to further contract in December as new restrictions could be introduced. Researchers have published a blueprint for producing millions of doses of a new vaccine within 100 days. The aim is to reduce the timeline from when a new virus is identified to the mass production of a vaccine. The new method could enable clinical trials to start within 60 days. Researchers believe that 1 billion vaccine doses could be supplied within 130 days of identification of a new virus. That is a quarter of the time taken by the current COVID jab. You are up to date. I'll be back with headlines for you in half an hour. For now, back to Tom and the briefing.
So there we have it. Christmas is saved. Last night, a video message from our gracious Prime Minister revealed that no new legal restrictions would be imposed before Boxing Day in England. But there's a catch. No new restrictions before Boxing Day. Nicola Sturgeon, of course, confirmed the same for Scotland yesterday, although spelled out a sting in the tail, detailing onerous restrictions to be imposed thereafter, including capacity limits, 1 metre distancing, table service in pubs, and in Wales. From the 27th of this month, nightclubs will be closed, a 2 metre social distancing rule introduced, sports played spectator-free, and one-way systems imposed upon shops. For his part, Northern Ireland's Health Minister Robin Swan has said we'll not boost our way simply out of Omicron. And further post-Christmas curbs are to be expected to be decided for that corner of our kingdom later today. And in England, of course, Boris Johnson is leaving the prospect of post-Christmas restrictions wide open. The upshot is bleak. Across the United Kingdom, it appears that the cost of, quote, saving Christmas will be to jettison January. In my view, that is a terrible bargain. the worst of both worlds. Positioning policy to protect one weekend of intergenerational mixing at the expected peak of the Omicron epidemic, only to then impose restrictions once cases are expected to be tumbling back down. That's madness. That's bad policy. This, as a primary course of action, is reportedly opposed not just by me, but by the scientists too. If restrictions, or preferably fresh advice, is to be imposed, that should be done now, not after the fact. I know I've said this a lot this week, but it really is an important point to hammer home. Everyone in this country is going to get Omicron in the next few months. That cannot be avoided. This disease is so incredibly infectious. I'm sure many of you will have had first or second-hand experience of that fact. It feels like half my contacts book have come down with the wretched thing in the last week alone. So the point here is not to prevent people getting Omicron. That's impossible. That cannot be done. The point must be to avoid people, especially vulnerable people, getting Omicron all at the same time. If half the country decides to have their Christmas celebrations next weekend instead of this weekend, that could halve the COVID pressure on the NHS in 2 to 3 weeks' time. That could be the difference between a vulnerable person getting the oxygen they need versus being left to suffer without adequate treatment. It could be the difference between life and death. Yet what is the earthly point of post-Christmas restrictions? What on earth are they meant to achieve, apart from making a miserable month a little bit more miserable? We should be aiming to spread the Omicron load over a number of weeks, rather than, in effect, encouraging one last big intergenerational party before everything gets restricted again. That's the message of policy in Scotland, in Wales, in Northern Ireland, and the message of the threat of policy in England too. Just like the curfew last year, this attempted intervention may well do more harm than good. Implicitly encouraging partying over Christmas, implying it can be paid for with restrictions later on. If measures are needed, the time for such measures is now. If we opt to not have measures now, there is no justification for onerous restrictions to be imposed after this weekend. But maybe the UK government knows this. Perhaps sense will be seen. Perhaps we'll have no onerous restrictions imposed after Boxing Day in this part of the United Kingdom after all. Although looking at Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, that might just be wishful thinking. Now, none of this is to say that Omicron is not a risk to public health. It is. Omicron is not a cold, it kills. It has the potential to cause severe problems for the NHS, to deny NHS care to many people, if, that is, everyone comes down with it at exactly the same time. It's just that the idea of long-lasting draconian restrictions after a big celebration seemed to me to be the very definition of shutting the stable door after the horse has bolted. It appears it's too late for Scotland, too late for Wales, and too late for Northern Ireland. But there's still time for England to see sense. Let's not plunge January into further onerous, potentially counterproductive draconian restrictions. Let's avoid that signal. Jettisoning January for the sake of a Christmas weekend is just too high a price to pay. Now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson has announced that there will be no new COVID restrictions in England before Christmas this year. But he did not rule out the possibility of introducing them later on.
Naturally, we can't rule out any further measures after Christmas, and we're going to keep a constant eye on the data. But in view of the continuing uncertainty about several things, severity of Omicron, uncertainty about the hospitalisation rate or the impact of the vaccine rollout and the boosters, we don't think today that there is enough evidence to justify any tougher measures before Christmas.
Meanwhile, in Scotland, of course, they'll implement new tough measures for social events and sport matches, but only from Boxing Day, cancelling Hogmanay celebrations for the new year. Today, First Minister Mark Drakeford will announce plans for COVID rules after Christmas in Wales, while Stormont ministers meet later to consider new COVID restrictions in Northern Ireland. Is the price of saving Christmas really going to be that we jettison January? Well, Alex Dean is a Conservative commentator and former special advisor to David Cameron, and I'm delighted to say he can join me now. Welcome to the programme, Alex. We've seen what's going on in Scotland. We saw that yesterday. Wales and Northern Ireland expected today. Is England going to simply follow suit?
Well, gosh, I hope not. I listened to your monologue with great interest, Tom, and I think everyone knows you're a nice guy and you mean this sincerely. But gosh, you've never seen a lockdown you didn't like, have you? I mean, you should be rejoicing, I think. We are facing a situation now where our infections from this new variant isn't ripping through in the way you describe. We were told by our scientists to be 1 million new cases a day, and up from that. And we're below 100,000. It's not even a tenth of what was threatened. So it seems to me that you can cheer up a bit, Tom.
Well, I think that my point in my monologue there is that the risk comes from one big day of mixing. I mean, we may well have a huge amount of problem this weekend. Although it does look, I think you're right. I mean, we have seen a bit of a levelling off in the cases, particularly in London. It looks that the sort of advice that may well have been given and the sort of mood music over the last 2 weeks has changed behaviour, and that might well be enough. Voluntary measures may well be enough here. Do you think that that could well continue?
I absolutely do. Voluntary measures are the best measures with which to deal with a health situation. Once the state accrues powers, it tends not to give them up, and certainly doesn't tend to give them up promptly. So if you can give us some advice, this is the discussion we've been having for 2 years now on this business, and people can make their own decisions. You know, people who are more vulnerable, choosing to self-isolate in a different way from people who are double jabbed and perhaps triple jabbed now and have already had COVID and can go about their lives in much more normal fashion. One of the things I took from your monologue is that we do agree we're going to have to learn to live with Omicron. Where we disagree is that I don't think we've got an either-or about saving Christmas or saving January. On these numbers, where it looks genuinely like we've decoupled infection rates from hospitalisation, it seems to me, and it's not totally clear yet, but that we may be able to have a free-ish Christmas and a free-ish January as well. And who wouldn't want that?
That is certainly a hopeful prospect. Of course, we don't know the full data. And the most annoying thing about this virus is that lag, is the idea that in order for restrictions to work, they need to be imposed early, but we might not necessarily know what restrictions may or may not be needed until it's too late. It's a very tricky position. I wouldn't want to be in the hot seat right now. I do have great sympathy for those who have to make those sorts of decisions. Do you agree with me, though, that the idea that there's this signal that restrictions may well be coming for New Year might give people the idea that they should go larger this Christmas than they otherwise might have done? Potentially signalling no restrictions for January might make people sort of even out, spread out their celebrations more than one big weekend of mixing. Potentially, the idea of imposing restrictions later on might well be counterproductive.
Yeah, human nature is such that you may well have a point about, you know, people wanting a big bang if they think that there's going to be a lockdown in the new year. But I certainly wouldn't look to Scotland or Wales, jurisdictions which I'm afraid have been terribly governed for quite some time under their respective party governments, for a lead on this. Thank goodness that the government has done the right thing here and not done a knee-jerk thing with restrictions. My point is, Tom, people think that, you know, governments are really reluctant to have lockdown and so forth. Actually, a lockdown is the politically easy thing to do. You get lots of plaudits and lots of pats on the back, and everyone says you've done the right thing. And if it turns out you didn't need it, people say better safe than sorry. Not having a lockdown, which can be economically disastrous for mental health, disastrous for children, disastrous for the abused, disastrous for the lonely. Not having a lockdown is the politically brave thing to do. And on the numbers we're currently looking at, I think it's the right thing to do.
Looking at the political numbers now, there was a rebellion in the House of Commons of just around 100 Conservative MPs against the relatively light touch measures of requiring COVID passports or a negative test for large events and nightclubs. If the Prime Minister were to attempt to bring forward similar measures to those that we saw announced in Scotland yesterday in the new year, potentially a recalled Parliament sometime next week, does he have any chance of getting those through?
I don't think so. I think that the size of the rebellion that we have, unless the facts really change, unless we see things with a real, genuine spike in the numbers, back to where the kind of terrifying, alarming scenarios that Sage was painting that have turned out each time not to be true. If for the first time we did get 1 million cases a day, when currently we've got 100,000 less, running at a tenth of what they threatened and claimed was going to happen. If we actually did see the kind of infections that they said, then I think people would change their minds. But short of that, the rebellion was simply too big. And the Prime Minister doesn't want to depend on the Labour Party. Indeed, in the end, the Labour Party may decide, heaven forbid, to oppose and seek to oppose the government on something and maybe bring it down, given the numbers that we saw rebelling last time. The Prime Minister won't want to risk that. I think that we saw the height of rebellion here because you're not going to see the Prime Minister push it any further.
Audacious claim, expecting the official opposition to actually oppose something the government does. I'm not sure that I'd put my eggs in that basket at this stage. Moving to the Cabinet, we saw Lord Frost, of course, sensationally resign over the weekend, in no small part due to COVID measures and the idea that we may well be rolling back on that unchangeable path to freedom that we were supposedly set upon in the summer. Who do you think would be most likely to resign were new measures to be proposed by this government?
Well, that's the trouble. I think we've got so many people who are, broadly speaking, lockdown sceptic. It's not one or two, it's any number. I think that it's quite apparent, isn't it, that Sajid Javid and Michael Gove are on the harder end of locking down more and locking down earlier. And broadly speaking, the weight of the rest of the Cabinet is not, whether it be on economic grounds like Rishi Sunak, Kwasi Kwarteng, on liberty-based grounds like Liz Truss and Dominic Raab. I think it's quite clear that the weight of the Cabinet is not in favour of extending restrictions. And that is one of the reasons I think the government made the right decision and didn't impose lockdowns on us, even as these cases of Omicron are falling. I would say one other thing, because we agree on another thing, Tom. The work from home guidance, which comes without any kind of sunset clause, was not voted on in Parliament, is far more restrictive than the measures over which people had an opportunity to rebel in the House of Commons. I think that's worth reflecting on, that whilst we had a good show of cabinet government, which is how democracy in the Westminster system is supposed to work, over lockdowns, elsewhere we've got some executive action from government that I find quite alarming and we should pay real attention to.
I suppose that is true. A lot of these signals that are being given to individuals and businesses that aren't in legislation are actually potentially some of the most damaging things that we have seen. We've seen that £1 billion has now had to be doled out to businesses simply for cancelled bookings. That's not as a result of any formal restrictions, but just as a result of advice.
Yeah, that's exactly my point. I think that government should be careful what it says. Now, of course, if they think that working from home guidance is the right thing to do, then of course they should pursue it. But gosh, as a Democrat, in the British sense of the word, I'd rather they did it in the House of Commons rather than passed it as an act of the executive. And I suppose, Tom, the other thing that I would say is this, that you see now the example of what's happening in Wales, where people can't go to work if they can work from home. Indeed, it becomes a criminal offence, but they can go to the pub. I mean, there is a government that's lost its compass in every basic way, isn't it? You know, they're trying to be populist on saying you can still socialise down the pub, but on the other hand, they're going to ruin businesses and economies and livelihoods. And there is a government that's basically a busted flush. So let's please not try and follow the Welsh example, because I think it's a very bad one.
I suppose it's not so different from the guidance that we had not so long ago in this country, in England, in terms of not going to work but going to those work Christmas parties. I'm not sure if that still stands. But just finally, in this conversation, Boris Johnson, his position as leader of the Conservative Party. We've heard a lot of scepticism over that. I think most people in Westminster can now envision in their mind's eye a Conservative Party not led by Boris Johnson. What do you give his chances for surviving the year?
Oh, much stronger than you imply. He has got 8 days left. But I think if you mean next year, I think much stronger than you imply as well. I mean, just as you've never seen a lockdown you didn't like, I'm only putting your leg, Tom, the Tory party's never seen a regicide it didn't like. And they always like to mutter about these things and talk about themselves in the tea rooms and so forth. But actually, I think we've probably seen the high point of efforts against the PM for now. People are going to go back to their constituencies over the course of the Christmas break. They're going to calm down a bit. And many of them are going to reflect on the fact that they owe their position in Westminster to the 80-seat majority that Boris Johnson won. They all live in a house that Boris built. It's now up for him to put it back in order.
Potentially, we've seen the highest point of Boris scepticism. Potentially, things might get a little bit better for this Prime Minister. Well, Alex Dean, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing. A fascinating political discussion there. Well, as we mentioned briefly, the Chancellor Rishi Sunak has pledged a £1 billion business bailout for those hardest hit by cancelled bookings and limited social interaction in recent weeks. The Chancellor announced grants of up to £6,000 for small and medium-sized hospitality and tourist venues who've been hit this December. Well, let's talk to John Ashmore, editor of the news website CapX, for a little bit more about this. Welcome to the programme, John. First of all, £1 billion. Is that enough money to really tide over the so many businesses that are seeing cancellations this Christmas?
Well, Tom, I'd say it's more than enough money to tide them over for about one evening of Christmas taking. For most of the businesses in question. Yeah, even in normal times, it wouldn't be enough. But remember that Christmas is such a busy period for hospitality businesses, mainly restaurants and pubs. You know, particularly in expensive parts of the country, £6,000 isn't even going to be half of their evening's takings on a busy time in Christmas. My only kind of caveat for that is that pubs and restaurants are all pretty empty at the moment anyway, because of all the kind of voluntary lockdown we're seeing at the moment, where, you know, people are being very cautious, trying not to spoil Christmas or infect any of their relatives. I know a lot of people who are kind of voluntarily isolating at the moment. They don't actually have COVID, they just don't want to risk catching it. So that's having a very depressing effect on hospitality as well. But no, I mean, £1 billion is one of those numbers. It sounds like a big number to you, the individual, but when you divide it by the hundreds of thousands of businesses we're talking about, it's not very much at all. It's a tiny little pinprick of a measure, really.
Which is interesting. We're talking about these voluntary measures. We're talking about people isolating by themselves. Is this really going to continue? Is this not a sort of a bad situation? There are no good choices here. Sort of avoiding a lockdown can still have incredibly harsh economic consequences because people change their behaviour if there's a lot of virus about.
Well, exactly. I mean, people, so-called sort of lockdown skeptics often like to point to Sweden, where they never had an official lockdown, but they still had much of the same behaviour that you would see in a lockdown, with people staying at home, businesses suffering and so forth. So there isn't this kind of very clean break between saving the economy and protecting us from the virus, because the economy is going to be in a real state if you, like you say, if you have a lot of virus around. The other thing to mention as well is we're talking a lot about the kind of the demand side here, if you like, the customers going to businesses and so on. But the other problem is staffing. I mean, if COVID is ripping through the economy, then a lot of businesses are going to really, really struggle to serve the customers they do have, because they simply don't have enough staff. And, you know, that's another huge problem, which I don't think gets talked about enough. And the same goes for the health service as well. I mean, that's a big problem. We don't have enough. If we have lots of doctors and nurses who are out of action with COVID, you know, that only exacerbates the problems with pressure on the NHS.
Well, just finally in this conversation, John, we've seen the growth figures have been revised down for the previous months leading up to Omicron. Not even because of Omicron, but actually before Omicron, growth was lower than we thought. Does this government have a growth problem?
Concerted vision for a growth-based sort of economic strategy. Most of what the government and its MPs boast about these days is actually sort of centre-leftish economic measures. You know, we're putting lots of money in these various pots for levelling up. Now, I think levelling up is a perfectly good aspiration, but it's got to be led by private sector growth, by organic economic activity. Simply shoveling money around the country is not a growth strategy. And, you know, we can see it in the figures as well, COVID notwithstanding. So, no, it's the short answer to your question, I'm afraid.
Well, let's hope that the new year can bring some fresh thinking for the government, a government that seems to have abandoned free markets, something that really led into Lord Frost's resignation as well from the Cabinet, potentially losing that intellectual argument, a concerning situation. But for now, John Ashmore, thank you very much for joining us on the briefing this morning, of course, the editor of the CapX website. Well, the Welsh First Minister, Mark Drakeford, is to outline his plans for COVID restrictions in the country after Christmas later on today. Omicron cases in Wales are predicted to reach several thousand by Boxing Day, with a number of different post-Christmas measures being considered to tackle the spread. Let's talk to Andrew R.T. Davies, the leader of the Welsh Conservative Party. Welcome to the programme. Is Wales simply going to follow Scotland today?
Good morning, Tom. Well, we don't know is the long and the short of it, because obviously the First Minister is going to give his update to the Welsh Parliament for the recall that I asked for yesterday at 1:30, and before that he's going to do a press conference. What we were told last Friday when he made his first announcement was that there would be no more restrictions this side of Christmas, yet we had an announcement yesterday in relation to sporting activity and basically all sporting activity going behind closed doors. Today we're expecting an announcement in relation to restrictions on personal movements in hospitality and maybe household gatherings. But it's really a death by a thousand cuts at the moment with this drip, drip, drip effect that's happening out of the Welsh Government here in Cardiff.
It does seem incredible that this sort of stuff is happening bit by bit in a not particularly organised way. Is that 3 different rule changes in the last week alone? Is it your view that there may well be changes ahead of Christmas and not just after Christmas today?
Well, it's less than a week, obviously, because the first batch of changes came through last Friday, and then we had a press release come out about sporting activity at midnight on Monday into Tuesday morning, and now here we are Wednesday with another raft of announcements. And contained within those announcements was the ludicrous rule that's going to come in that actually, if you're not working from home, that the Welsh Government have empowered enforcement agencies to fine you £60 unless you've got a valid reason not to go into work. And if you're an employer, you're going to be fined up to, and listen to this, up to £10,000. Now, I would suggest that every workplace is different. We do want to make sure people take personal responsibility, but to fine people because they have to go into work to earn a pound or two to pay the mortgage and put bread on the table does seem a farcical way of winning public confidence in my mind.
No, it's interesting, given that your complaint up until now has been a lack of scrutiny for these measures. Have these measures been voted on at all, or are these simply things that the Welsh Executive can pass down from on high?
The latter of your pronouncements there, which is passed down from on high, because that's why I tabled a letter to the presiding officer of the Welsh Parliament yesterday to call for a recall so that members could be informed of the changes, because like the rest of the people of Wales, we just all saw it in a press release at midnight on Monday about sporting activities, and then we had it land in our inboxes that there was going to be a press conference on Wednesday. That's no way to function in a democracy. Regrettably, there won't be a vote this afternoon. It is merely a statement, and people can say what they want about Westminster and the Westminster government, but ultimately the Prime Minister and his ministers take their proposals to Parliament, debate them and get them voted on, and that's how democracy should work. And when you're taking away people's civil liberties and putting restrictions in place that ultimately could end up in fines, as I've talked about going to work, these are the type of things that need a debate, need a discussion, need to be tested and ultimately voted on. It's without question that the First Minister does have the votes in the Welsh Parliament, but that's besides the point. You have a Parliament because you have democracy.
And so just with the Welsh Conservative Party position, I take it from your criticism that you oppose the fines for individuals and businesses in terms of not allowing them discretion over whether they turn up to work or not. What would a Welsh Conservative administration in the Senedd be doing at this point? What would be the restrictions that you would be contemplating, or would you not at all?
Well, we'd be led by the science, obviously, and we do know that the Omicron variant is transmissible, highly transmissible, and that's where the restrictions need to be focused on. Thankfully, the emerging evidence seems to show that the effects of the Omicron variant aren't as severe as the Delta variant, although that's an emerging picture. I accept that point of view. We wouldn't have had COVID passes like we've got here in Wales, which is ironic because we were told 4 weeks ago, that COVID passes would mitigate the need for these restrictions. Yet two of the first facilities to be hit hard by restrictions, nightclubs and sporting activity, were the two main vents that obviously had to apply the passports, the COVID passports. So we're getting some restrictions coming through because they sound good, but in practice don't actually achieve a whole hell of a lot. And we need to be led by the science on this. And the emerging science is that obviously the Omicron virus, while it's highly transmittable, thankfully doesn't seem to have the severe effects that the Delta variant had and the hospitalization rates. Now, I appreciate that's an emerging picture. And we've also got to be minded as well about the sickness rates within our key public services and how we protect our key public workers so those services can function.
No, it's an interesting point there, the idea that some of these measures may well just be sort of wallpaper, may just be signalling rather than actually doing all that much themselves. I'm afraid we've run out of time in this interview and indeed the programme, but Andrew R.T. Davies, leader of the Welsh Conservative Party, thank you very much for joining us this morning on The Briefing on GB News. Well, coming up, it's To The Point with Patrick Christys and Mercy Moroki. But first, here's a look at the weather.
It's time to remind ourselves there's always another winter. Canary Islands sponsors the weather.
Hello there, good morning. Bright for some today, frosty for many, more cloud towards the west with some outbreaks of rain for Northern Ireland pushing ever northeastwards. Now, high pressure's been in charge of our weather, at least for a week or so, bringing calm conditions. It's now left the shores of the UK and low pressure lurking to the west across the mid-Atlantic, delivering cloud outbreaks of rain over the next few days and some milder conditions for a time. But if you are stepping out first thing this morning, it's going to be cold and frosty, but it will be bright, certainly some hazy sunshine. Further west, always more cloud outbreaks of rain arriving across Northern Ireland through the middle part of the morning, pushing up towards western Scotland. We could see spits and spots